The morning sun cast long shadows across Harold Matthews' front porch as he settled into his favorite wooden rocking chair. At 93 years old, his movements were slower than they used to be, but his mind remained as sharp as ever. His weathered hands racked around a steaming cup of coffee, black, just as he drunk it during his days in the Marines. The small town of Pine Grove had been Harold's home for the past 45 years. He'd moved here after retiring from his job as a high school history teacher, choosing this quiet street on the outskirts of town for its peaceful atmosphere. His modest white house, with its well-kept garden and American flag flying proudly by the door, had become a familiar sight to everyone in the neighborhood. Every morning, Harold followed the same routine he'd maintained since his wife Martha passed away 5 years ago. He would wake up at exactly 6 o'clock a.m., make his bed with military precision, and prepare a simple breakfast of toast and eggs. Then, he'd put on his clean-pressed clothes, usually a light blue button-down shirt and khaki pants, and head out to tend to his garden before the day grew too hot. Today was different, though. As Harold sat on his porch, he noticed unusual activity down the street. Workers were busy transforming the old Wilson's hardware store into something new. The faded hardware store sign came down, replaced by a bright neon one that read Road Warriors Bar and Grill. Harold frowned slightly as he watched 3 motorcycles rumble past his house, their riders heading toward the new establishment. "Times are changing, Martha," he mumbled to himself, a habit he'd developed since losing his wife. "But I suppose that's what we fought for, letting people live as they choose." As the morning wore on, Harold made his way to his beloved garden. His tomato plants were coming in nicely, and the roses Martha had planted years ago still bloomed beautifully each spring. He worked slowly but steadily, pulling weeds and checking the soil moisture. The neighborhood children often stopped by to watch him work, fascinated by his stories of the war and his seemingly magical ability to make things grow. "Good morning, Mr. Matthews," called Sarah, the 10-year-old girl from next door, as she rode past on her bicycle. Her mother, Jenny, walked a few steps behind. "Good morning, Sarah." "Jenny," Harold replied with a warm smile. "The zucchini are almost ready. Make sure to tell your mother to stop by next week for some fresh ones." Jenny waved and smiled. "We will, Harold. Don't work too hard out here in the sun." Harold chuckled. He'd heard that warning countless times, but he knew his limits. The garden kept him active and gave him purpose. Besides, he'd survived far worse than a little sunshine, though he rarely spoke about those days unless asked. Inside his house, carefully arranged photos told the story of his life. Pictures of him in his Marine uniform stood proudly on the mantel, alongside shots of his wedding day with Martha, their 2 children, now living in different states, and their 5 grandchildren. His Distinguished Service Cross and other medals were displayed in a simple wooden case, not prominently, but with dignity. As evening approached, the sound of motorcycles grew more frequent. Harold sat in his living room, reading one of his favorite history books, when a particularly loud group roared past, their engines echoing through his windows. He glanced at Martha's picture and smiled gently. "Well, dear," he said softly, "looks like our quiet street might not be so quiet anymore." Before heading to bed that night, Harold stood at his window, watching as more motorcycles gathered at the newly opened bar. The neon signs cast an unfamiliar glow on the streak he'd known for so long. Some of the bikers were laughing loudly, their voices carrying through the night air. Harold wasn't worried, though. He'd seen the world change many times over his 93 years. He'd witnessed humanity at its worst during the war, but he'd also seen the incredible capacity for good in people. As he prepared for bed, following his nightly routine with military precision, he remained optimistic. After all, he'd learned long ago that you couldn't judge a book by its cover, or a person by the vehicle they rode. Little did Harold know that his peaceful life was about to face a challenge that would test not just his patience, the very principles he fought to defend all those years ago. 3 weeks after the Road Warriors Bar and Grill opened, Harold's peaceful mornings were just a memory. The rumble of motorcycles had become a constant soundtrack to his days, with bikes roaring past his house at all hours. Even his beloved garden couldn't provide the peace it once had. One particularly loud Thursday morning, Harold decided it was time to have a polite word with the bikers. He put on his best blue shirt, carefully combed his silver hair, and walked slowly but purposefully down the street to the bar. The morning crowd was small, just 5 motorcycles parked outside. As Harold pushed open the heavy wooden door, Conversation stopped. Three young men in leather vests turned to stare at him from their seats at the bar. Behind the counter, a bartender with tattooed arms raised an eyebrow. "Good morning," Harold said clearly, his voice steady despite his age. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything important." A muscular young man with a shaved head and a snake tattoo on his neck snickered. "Look what just walked in, boys. Someone's grandpa got lost." Harold ignored the comment and walked forward, his shoes making soft sounds on the wooden floor. "I'm Harold Matthews. I live in the White House up the street." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "I wanted to have a friendly chat about the motorcycle noise, especially late at night." The snake-tattooed man, whose leather vest identified him as Razor, stood up. He was at least a foot taller than Harold. "Oh yeah? And what about the noise, Cramps?" "Well," Harold continued calmly, "many of us in the neighborhood are early sleepers. I was hoping we could reach an understanding about keeping the engines a bit quieter, especially after dark." Razor laughed, and his friends joined in. "You hear that, boys? Grandpa wants us to be quiet so he can get his beauty sleep." He walked closer to Harold, towering over him. "Here's what I understand, old man. This is our street now. Don't like the noise? Maybe it's time for you to check into one of those old folks' homes." Harold stood his ground, looking up at Razor with calm eyes. "Son, I'm not here to cause trouble. I'm just asking for a little courtesy." "Son?" Razor's face darkened. "I ain't your son, old-timer. And you know what? I think we need to make sure you understand how things work around here now." That evening, the noise was worse than ever. Motorcycles roared past Harold's house every few minutes, their engines revving loudly enough to ravel his windows. Some riders did wheelies on his street, leaving black tire marks on the asphalt. Others threw empty beer cans onto his lawn. Harold's neighbor Jenny came over, worried. "Harold, maybe you should call the police," she suggested, helping him pick up the scattered cans from his garden. "They're just young folks testing boundaries," Harold replied, though his heart was heavy seeing the tire marks across his driveway. "The police have more important things to handle." But the next morning, Harold discovered his mailbox had been knocked over and someone had spray-painted the word "Leave" on his front sidewalk. As he scrubbed at the graffiti with an old brush, more motorcycles roared past, their riders laughing and pointing. Sarah, Jenny's daughter, watched from her yard with tears in her eyes. "Why are they being so mean, Mr. Matthews?" Harold straightened up slowly, his back aching from bending over to clean the sidewalk. "Sometimes, Sarah, people forget that strength isn't about making others feel small. True strength is about how you treat others, especially those who can't fight back." That night, as Harold sat in his living room, he looked at the old photographs on his wall. There he was, much younger, standing with his Marine unit in Europe. They had faced real battles, real enemies. These young bikers weren't evil. They were just lost, looking for power in all the wrong places. A motorcycle's roar interrupted his thoughts, followed by the crash of breaking glass. Someone had thrown a bottle at his front window. As Harold stood to check the damage, he heard more laughter and engines revving outside. The harassment had officially begun, and Harold Matthews, at 93 years old, knew this was just the beginning of a very different kind of battle than the ones he'd fought in his youth. The next 2 weeks brought changes to Harold's daily life that he never could have imagined. His peaceful routine was completely destroyed by the constant harassment from the bikers. Every morning, he found new damage to his property, trampled flowers, broken branches from his trees, and trash scattered across his yard. Officer Thompson, a local policeman who had known Harold for years, stood in the garden one morning, shaking his head as he wrote in his notebook. "This is the 4th report this week, Harold," he said, looking at the latest vandalism. Crude words scratched into Harold's garage door. "I hate to say it, but maybe you should consider moving somewhere safer." Harold straightened his back, despite the pain that had been bothering him lately. "Move? This is my home, David. Martha and I built our life here. Our children grew up in this house." He pointed to the rose bushes along the fence. "Those roses have bloomed every spring for 40 years. I'm not leaving." As Officer Thompson left, promising to increase patrols, though they both knew it wouldn't help much, Razor and 3 other bikers rode slowly past the house. They revved their engines and made threatening gestures at Harold, who stood calmly watching them from his porch. Later that afternoon, Harold's daughter Alice called from California. Dad, Jenny next door told me what's happening, she said, her voice worried. Please come stay with us for a while, just until things calm down. Now, Alice, Harold replied, sitting in his favorite chair by the window. You know I can't do that. Who would take care of the garden? And Mr. Whiskers needs me. He looked at his old orange cat sleeping on the windowsill. Dad, please. Alice begged. You're 93. You shouldn't have to deal with this. Age has nothing to do with standing up for what's right, Harold said firmly. I didn't back down in Bastogne when things got tough, and I won't back down now. That evening, Harold was watering his surviving plants when he heard motorcycles approaching. This time, there were more of them, at least 8 bikes. They circled his house, their engines roaring so loudly that the noise seemed to shake the ground. Razor, their leader, stopped his bike at the end of Harold's driveway. Hey, old man, he shouted over the engine noise. Still haven't gotten the message? This ain't no retirement community anymore. Harold continued watering his plants, appearing not to notice them. This seemed to make Razor angrier. He revved his engine harder and rode his motorcycle right onto Harold's lawn, leaving deep tracks in the grass. The other bikers followed, circling Harold like sharks. Jenny ran out of her house next door. I'm calling the police, she yelled. Go ahead, lady, one of the bikers laughed. They'll get here just in time to help Grandpa pack his bags. Harold finally turned off his garden hose and faced the bikers. Despite being surrounded by roaring motorcycles and angry young men, his voice was steady when he spoke. You know, when I was in the war, we had a saying, the loudest ones are usually the most scared. This made Razor kill his engine. The sudden silence was almost as loud as the noise had been. What did you say, old man? I said, Harold repeated, looking directly into Razor's eyes, that all this noise and intimidation, it usually comes from fear. What are you afraid of, son? For a moment, something flickered across Razor's face, surprise, maybe even a hint of shame, but it quickly disappeared. You're gonna regret trying to play mind games with us, old-timer, he growled. Boys, let's show him what we do to people who don't respect our territory. The bikers began doing burnouts all over Harold's lawn, their tires tearing up the grass and sending dirt flying everywhere. The garden he had tended so carefully was being destroyed before his eyes. But Harold didn't move. He stood straight and tall, watching them with the same steady gaze that had once faced down German tanks in the frozen forests of Belgium. As the chaos continued around him, Harold silently reached into his pocket and touched the small object he always carried there, his old Marine Corps medallion. He knew that sometimes the greatest battles weren't fought with weapons, but with courage and dignity, and Harold Matthews had plenty of both. That night, after the bikers had finally left Harold's destroyed lawn, the old veteran sat in his living room with only a small lamp for light. His bones ached from standing so long, but his spirit remained unbroken. Outside, he could still hear motorcycles rumbling past his house, their riders shouting and laughing. A loud crash suddenly broke through the evening quiet. Harold rose slowly from his chair and walked to his front window. In the dim street light, he could see 3 young bikers, not Razor's usual group, but newer ones trying to prove themselves. They were throwing rocks at his house, trying to break more windows. Hey, one of them shouted, noticing Harold at the window. Old man's watching us. Let's give him a better show. The young biker, wearing a leather jacket too big for his skinny frame, started walking toward Harold's front door. Harold didn't move away from the window. Instead, he reached over and turned on the bright porch light, illuminating the front of his house. The sudden light made the bikers pause. Check it out, said another one, pointing at Harold's window. Look at all those old pictures on his wall. Through the window, clearly visible now in the porch light's glow, was Harold's collection of military photographs and medals. The largest photo showed a young Harold in his Marine dress uniform, standing proud and tall after receiving his Distinguished Service Cross. Next to it hung the medal itself, along with other commendations from his service in World War II. The skinny biker pulled out his phone and started taking pictures through the window. This is perfect. Wait till social media sees this old biplane soldier, he laughed, snapping more photos. Bet these are fake anyway. No way this old-timer was a real Marine. Inside, Harold watched them quietly. He didn't try to stop them from taking pictures or yell at them to leave. He simply stood there, his reflection in the window glass overlaying the young Marine he had once been in the photographs. The third biker, who had been quiet until now, moved closer to the window. His eyes widened as he looked at one particular photo, a black and white image of Harold with his unit in the Ardennes forest during the Battle of the Bulge. The soldiers in the picture were covered in snow, their faces tired but determined. "Dude, post those pictures everywhere," the skinny biker said, still laughing. "Caption it, Old Man's Fantasy War Stories or something. Show everyone what a joke this guy is." As they continued taking photos and making fun of Harold's military mementos, none of them noticed the small detail in one corner of the largest photograph, the clear image of the Distinguished Service Cross ceremony, with General Patton himself pinning the medal on young Harold's chest. The bikers finally left after running out of rocks to throw, but the damage was done. Not to Harold's windows or his house, to something they didn't understand. They had just broadcast his most sacred memories across social media, turning his years of service and sacrifice into a source of mockery. Harold slowly cleaned up the broken glass from his floor, his movements deliberate and careful. As he worked, he thought about the young men outside. They reminded him of some of the soldiers he had served with, young, angry at the world, looking for somewhere to belong. The difference was, his fellow Marines had found purpose in serving others, not in causing pain. Later that night, as Harold prepared for bed, his phone rang. It was his son James from Ohio. "Dad," James said, his voice worried, "I just saw some awful posts online. These punks took pictures of your service photos and they're making fun of them. Do you want me to come down there?" Harold smiled slightly, though his heart was heavy. "No need, son. Sometimes people have to learn the hard way about respect and honor. Besides," he added, looking at the old photo of his unit, "those pictures tell a story these young folks don't understand yet, but they will. Truth has a way of coming to light." What Harold didn't know was that those disrespectful photos were already spreading far beyond the local biker groups, reaching people who would recognize exactly what they were seeing, and who would not be happy about how a decorated Marine veteran was being treated. 2 days after the photos were posted online, Mike "Iron Bear" Thompson sat in his garage 3 towns over, staring at his phone with growing anger. The former Marine sergeant, now president of the Veterans Motorcycle Alliance, had received dozens of messages about the viral posts mocking an old veteran. "Hey, Bear," he called to his wife. "Come look at this." He zoomed in on the military photos from Harold's wall. "That's a Distinguished Service Cross ceremony. And is that General Patton?" His wife leaned in closer. "Those punks have no idea who they're messing with, do they?" Iron Bear shook his head and started making calls. Within hours, veteran bikers from 3 states were sharing the photos and information about Harold Matthews. One member, a military historian, found old records of Harold's unit and their actions during the Battle of the Bulge. "Listen to this," Iron Bear read from his phone during an emergency meeting at their clubhouse. December 1944, Private First Class Harold Matthews led 6 men through heavy enemy fire to rescue a trapped platoon. Despite being wounded, he made 3 trips across exposed ground to bring medical supplies and ammunition. His actions saved 28 lives. The room full of veteran bikers fell silent. On the wall behind them hung their own service medals and unit flags, a reminder of the brotherhood they shared with Harold. "That's not all," continued Iron Bear. "He received the Purple Heart, Bronze Star, and later, the Distinguished Service Cross. This man is a living legend, and these punks are treating him like a joke." Meanwhile, back in Pine Grove, Harold noticed something different that morning. The usual roar of motorcycles had gone quiet. Instead of Razor and his gang, a different kind of biker appeared on his street. These riders were older, many with military stickers on their bikes. They rode past his house slowly, respectfully, some offering salutes as they passed. Around noon, a massive man with a gray beard pulled up in front of Harold's house on a spotless Harley-Davidson. Iron Bear removed his helmet and walked up to Harold's porch, where the old veteran was sitting in his rocking chair. "Mr. Matthews," Iron Bear said, standing at attention. "Sergeant Mike Thompson, United States Marine Corps, retired. Permission to approach, sir." Harold's eyes twinkled with recognition of military courtesy. "Granted, Sergeant. And at ease, I was just a PFC. With respect, sir, a Distinguished Service Cross holder outranks me any day." Iron Bear pulled out his phone. We've seen what's been happening here. Those photos they posted, they didn't make you look foolish like they thought. They revealed a hero to people who understand what those medals mean. As they talked, more veteran bikers began arriving. They parked their motorcycles carefully, away from Harold's damaged lawn. Many wore their old unit patches and military memorial vests. They gathered respectfully at the end of his driveway, waiting. "Mr. Matthews," Iron Bear said, "every one of these men and women are veterans. We've read about what you did at Bastogne. Those young punks disrespecting you. They're about to learn some hard lessons about honor and brotherhood." Harold looked at the gathering of veteran bikers, their faces serious and respectful. "I don't want any violence," he said firmly. "These young people are lost, not evil." Iron Bear smiled. "No violence, sir. We're going to handle this the Marine Corps' way, with discipline and respect. But first," he gestured to some of his members, "we'd like to help fix your garden. Marines take care of their own." For the rest of the afternoon, veteran bikers carefully replanted Harold's damaged flowers, repaired his fence, and cleaned up the vandalism. They listened to his stories about the war, about teaching history afterward, about his late wife Martha. Word spread quickly through the biker community, both about Harold's heroic past and about the respect being shown by the veteran riders. As the sun began to set, Harold watched from his porch as Iron Bear organized teams of veterans to patrol the neighborhood. The message was clear. This decorated Marine was now under the protection of his brothers and sisters in arms. The real question was, how would Razor and his gang react when they discovered that their victim had an army of his own? The next morning, Razor and his gang roared into the neighborhood, ready for their usual harassment of Harold. But as they turned onto the street, they came face to face with something unexpected. A line of 30 motorcycles parked neatly along both sides of the road, their riders standing at attention. Iron Bear stepped forward as Razor's group slowed to a stop. The contrast between the two groups was striking. The veteran bikers stood tall, their vests displaying military patches and unit insignias. Razor and his friends suddenly looked very young and uncertain. "Good morning," Iron Bear said calmly, his voice carrying across the quiet street. "I believe we need to have a conversation about respect." Razor tried to maintain his tough image, but his voice wavered slightly. "This isn't your territory. What's your problem?" "Our problem," Iron Bear replied, "is that you've been harassing a decorated Marine Corps veteran, a man who earned the Distinguished Service Cross from General Patton himself, a hero who saved 28 lives while wounded in one of the bloodiest battles of World War II. The color drained from some of the younger bikers' faces. One of them whispered to Razor, "Dude, I told you those medals looked real." Harold appeared on his porch, walking slowly down the steps with the help of his cane. The veteran bikers saluted him as he passed. Even some of Razor's gang found themselves straightening up instinctively at the sight of the old Marine. "Mr. Matthews," one of Razor's younger friends spoke up, "is it true? Were you really there at the Battle of the Bulge?" Before Harold could answer, more motorcycles rumbled into the street. These riders were from other veteran clubs, Navy, Army, Air Force, all coming to show their support. Some had driven hundreds of miles after seeing the viral photos online. The street filled with the sound of engines, but this time it wasn't threatening. It was respectful, almost like a salute. Local news crews began arriving too. They had gotten word of the gathering, and the story was too good to pass up. Cameras rolled as Harold stood among his fellow veterans, his back straight despite his years. "Look around," Iron Bear addressed Razor's group. "Every person here understands something you don't. That strength isn't about intimidation. It's about standing up for what's right, and every one of us is ready to stand up for Mr. Matthews." Jenny and Sarah watched from their yard as more people from the neighborhood came out to see what was happening. Someone brought out coffee and donuts. Others carried chairs for the older veterans. The scene that had been one of fear and harassment just days ago was transforming into something like a community gathering. Razor looked increasingly uncomfortable. His followers were shifting nervously on their bikes, some avoiding eye contact with the veterans. The tough image they had worked so hard to maintain was crumbling in the face of real strength and dignity. "We didn't know," one of Razor's friends finally said, his voice quiet. "About his service, about what he did in the war. We thought he was just an old man." Iron Bear finished. "That's your first lesson right there. You never know someone's story until you take the time to listen and learn. Harold raised his hand, and the street fell silent. Young man, he addressed Razor directly. I don't want your apology. What I want is for you to understand something. These men and women here, they're not here for revenge. They're here because they believe in something bigger than themselves, just like I did when I was your age. The morning sun caught the medals on the veterans' vests, making them shine. News cameras captured the moment as Harold walked slowly toward Razor's group. The old Marine's eyes were kind but firm as he spoke again. So now you have a choice to make. You can either leave this neighborhood and find somewhere else to cause trouble, or you can stay and learn what real brotherhood means. These veterans didn't come here to fight you. They came to teach you, if you're willing to learn. The street waited in silence for Razor's response, and in that moment, it was clear that everything was about to change. Razor sat on his motorcycle, looking from Harold to the gathered veterans, then back to his own gang. The tough mask he usually wore was cracking, revealing the uncertain young man beneath. The street remained silent, waiting for his decision. Finally, Razor switched off his bike's engine. The sudden quiet seemed to change something in the air. He slowly got off his motorcycle and took a step toward Harold. Iron Bear and several other veteran bikers tensed, ready to move if needed. But Harold raised his hand slightly, telling them to wait. He could see something in Razor's eyes that the others couldn't yet see, confusion, and maybe a hint of shame. Sir, Razor said, his voice different from the mocking tone he'd used in previous weeks. I want to see them. The medals, the photos. If that's okay. Harold nodded. Come with me, son. He turned to walk back to his house, his cane tapping softly on the sidewalk. Razor hesitated, then followed. The contrast was striking, the tall, muscular young biker walking behind the small, elderly veteran. Inside Harold's living room, the morning sun illuminated the wall of photographs and medals. Razor stood silently, looking at the images of young Harold and his fellow Marines. That's me, Harold said, pointing to a photograph of young soldiers in heavy winter gear. Bastogne, December 1944. We were surrounded by German forces. No supplies, no winter clothes, running out of ammunition, but we held the line. Razor moved closer to the photo. How old were you? 18, Harold replied. Not much younger than you are now. The young biker's eyes widened. He looked at more photos. Harold receiving his Distinguished Service Cross, Harold with his unit after liberation, Harold helping wounded soldiers. What made you do it? Razor asked quietly. Risk your life for others. Harold sat down in his chair, his movements slow but deliberate. Because that's what real strength is, son. Not intimidating those weaker than you, but protecting them. Not destroying things, but building them up. Not taking from others, but giving of yourself. Outside, they could hear the mixed sounds of veteran bikers talking with Razor's gang members. The tension was easing as stories were shared and connections were made. I've been watching you, these past weeks, Harold continued. You remind me of some of the men I served with. Strong, full of fire, looking for a purpose. But they found that purpose in serving others, not in causing pain. Razor sat down on the floor near Harold's chair, something he hadn't done since he was a child. I messed up, didn't I? Really messed up. Yes, Harold said simply. But the measure of a person isn't in their mistakes, it's in how they choose to make things right. The young biker looked at the Distinguished Service Cross in its case. How? How do I fix this? Harold smiled gently. Start by understanding that the strength you're looking for, the respect you want, it doesn't come from making others fear you. It comes from earning their trust, from standing up for what's right, even when it's hard. Tears started forming in Razor's eyes, but he quickly wiped them away. I don't know how to do that. Well, Harold said, reaching out to put a weathered hand on the young man's shoulder, you've got a whole street full of teachers out there who'd be willing to show you. Veterans who've learned these lessons the hard way, just like I did. Through the window, they could see Iron Bear showing some of Razor's gang members his service photos. Other veterans were sharing stories, and even some of the younger bikers were starting to ask questions and listen respectfully. Mr. Matthews, Razor said, standing up and squaring his shoulders. I want to make this right. Tell me what to do. Harold rose slowly from his chair. First, We go outside and you apologize to everyone you've hurt. Then we rebuild what's been broken, not just my garden, the trust of this community. And then, he smiled, you learn what it really means to be strong. Together, they walked back out into the morning sunlight, where a new chapter was about to begin. 3 months later, Harold Street looked very different from the day of the confrontation. His garden was not only restored but flourishing, with new flowers and vegetables growing in neat rows. The lawn, once torn up by motorcycle tracks, was now green and well maintained. But the biggest changes weren't in the landscape, they were in the people. Every Saturday morning, motorcycles still gathered in front of Harold's house. But now, instead of causing trouble, the riders came to help with yard work, listen to stories, and learn from the veterans who had become their mentors. Razor, who now preferred to be called by his real name, Jack, was often the first to arrive. Morning, Mr. Matthews, Jack called out as he parked his bike carefully on the street. He carried a box of donuts and a thermos of coffee. Brought breakfast for everyone. Harold sat in his usual spot on the porch, smiling as he watched more bikes arrive. Iron Bear and his veteran riders still came regularly, not to protect Harold anymore, but to share their wisdom with the younger generation of bikers who were eager to learn. The tomatoes are coming in nicely, Jack said, checking the garden he had helped rebuild. My mom couldn't believe it when I brought some home last week, said she never thought she'd see me growing vegetables. The Road Warriors Bar and Grill had changed too. Under Jack's influence, it had become a meeting place for both veteran and young riders. The walls now displayed military photos and unit flags alongside motorcycle memorabilia. Weekly gatherings brought together former soldiers and young bikers, building bridges between generations. Sarah, the young girl next door, no longer had to watch Harold's house with worry. Instead, she helped tend the garden alongside the bikers, learning about plants from Harold and about motorcycles from her new friends. Her mother Jenny had even started organizing community dinners where veterans shared their stories. Mr. Matthews, Jack said, sitting on the porch steps near Harold's chair. Remember what you told me that day? About real strength? Harold nodded, sipping his morning coffee. I remember. Well, we've been putting it into practice. The club. We're starting a program for at-risk kids, teaching them about motorcycles, but also about respect, honor, and giving back to the community. Iron Bear and some of the other vets are helping us set it up. Around them, the street buzzed with activity. Veteran bikers chatted with their younger counterparts, sharing experiences and advice. Some worked in the garden, others helped repair a neighbor's fence, and a few gathered around Harold's old military photos, listening to stories about courage and sacrifice. You know what's funny? Jack continued. 3 months ago, we thought this street was our territory. Now we realize it's our home, and that's different. Harold's eyes twinkled. Territory is something you take. Home is something you build together. Later that afternoon, as the sun began to set, the group gathered for their weekly barbecue in Harold's backyard. Iron Bear stood up to make an announcement. Today, we're doing something special, he said, his voice carrying across the yard. Jack, come up here. Jack walked forward, looking surprised. Iron Bear pulled out a new leather vest. This vest, Iron Bear explained, represents membership in our Veterans Support Riders Association. We only give it to those who demonstrate true understanding of what service and brotherhood mean. Jack has earned this. As Jack put on the vest, his hands shaking slightly, Harold watched from his chair. He saw not the angry young man who had once threatened him, but someone who had learned the same lessons he had learned so many years ago in the freezing forests of Bastogne, that real strength comes from protecting others, that respect is earned through actions, not fear, and that it's never too late to choose a better path. The street that had once been a battleground had become a place of healing and growth. Harold's stand against intimidation had led not to more conflict, but to understanding. His quiet courage had shown that sometimes the greatest victories come not from defeating others, but from helping them find their way. As the evening wound down, Harold looked at his flourishing garden, the mixed group of young and old riders sharing stories and laughter, and the community that had grown stronger through adversity. At 93 years old, he had fought one last battle, not with fists or weapons, but with wisdom and compassion. And just like in Bastogne all those years ago, he had won by refusing to back down from what he knew was right.